Welcome to Awaken the Mind, the NLP and Hypnosis Guide, hosted by David Uhas.
You're listening to Awaken the Mind, the NLP and Hypnosis Guide, a podcast that inspires the curious to the professional to discover meaningful content and pursue their passions. My name is David Uhas, and I'm a master NLP practitioner and hypnotist, best known for losing over 100 pounds and running 6 marathons in 2 years. And I'm sitting down with hypnotists, NLP practitioners, and coaches to talk about their process, the lessons they've learned, and how to make an impact in the lives of others. Our guest today is Matt Bennett. He has a master's degree in community psychology and executive development, nonprofit management, as well as a master's in business administration and healthcare. Mr. Bennett specializes in the delivery of trauma-informed care, quality improvement, results-based leadership, and motivational interviewing. Mr. Bennett has successfully combined his academic pursuits as a researcher, blogger, and publisher author with his practical experience in leading nonprofit organizations and educational institutions to develop research-based solutions to improve the health of individuals, organizations, and systems. As a sought-after trainer, Mr. Bennett utilizes a participant-centered approach, which includes interactions and adult learning activities to maximize learning, retention, and application. These approaches, combined with a strong mastery of the topical research, allow delivery of an in-depth subject matter in a practical manner targeted to the audience. Mr. Bennett's presentations are a dynamic dance of innovative research, practical applications, and a passion for the art and science of helping others. Matthew is the author of the book, Connecting Paradigms, a Trauma-Informed and Neurobiological Framework for Motivational Interviewing Implementation. If you have not heard about MI, Motivational Interviewing, this is an incredible tool. Please listen and learn about the powerful structure and process to move your clients into their fighting for their reasons and ownership of their challenges and their wanting to change. Today we learn about Matthew's roots in helping others, his expertise in motivational interviewing, and his insights on addictions and what it takes for change to take place in others who face possibly the biggest challenges of change, big A addictions. I'm honored to have Matthew on the show today. Please welcome our guest today, Matthew Bennett. Hello, Matthew.
Thank you so much. Boy, you got through that intro much better than I would have. Yes, boy, I sound impressive. Who is this guy you're talking about?
You are impressive. Well, thank you for being here today.
It's an honor. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So you're in Colorado. How's the weather there?
We were in the 60s today and sunny, which if you've not been to Colorado, we are a mile higher to the sun. So we don't have a whole lot of humidity. So days like today, you almost want to put the shorts on. So you're like winter coat in the morning, maybe some shorts in the afternoon. It could snow 4 feet tomorrow. So Colorado, every place in the country says the weather's going to change. Here, I've actually seen it change 65 degrees in about 3 hours. So it's great, but we had one of those great Colorado sunny winter days today.
Nice. It's funny because I always thought of Colorado, and I want to say Amy Grant with like 3 foot of snow on the rooftop, and I didn't realize it's actually a really nice weather there during the wintertime.
And I got to swear you to secrecy because we tried to keep the whole that Colorado is a great place to live secret for years, and people have found out. So it's if you like seasons, I don't know if you get better weather than Denver, Colorado. So we're really fortunate in that way.
Nice. Well, hey, let's jump into it. Tell me about yourself growing up, your family, school, role models.
Yeah, well, I think the best way to describe me growing up was I was a son of a basketball coach in Indiana. With all the stress, a little bit of trauma, and my life revolved around a bunch of high school kids putting a basketball through a hoop. And so I grew up, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, all those guys were my heroes, and, played actually basketball through college. And I originally peeked around the corner to psychology because I thought, before I kind of woke up and saw as an adult what my dad had to go through to be a basketball coach, that psychology would actually help me be a better coach. And somewhere along the line, I realized that even though I still love basketball, it was a game, and I really fell in love with psychology and just the idea that I could get paid a little bit of money, not being rich or famous or anything, but, a little bit of money to help people. And, when I had that realization, I was like, I could deal with 18-year-olds putting a ball through the hoop, or I could really help people utilize what I'd learned to really, help people who are struggling with things like homelessness, addiction, all the really difficult behavioral changes, maybe live a little bit of a better life. And I think these years later, I made the right choice. Even though sometimes you look at those coaching salaries, if I ever got up to college or the pros, and I'll never make anywhere close to that. But, I like to say I'm sure I'm happier. So
Nice. Well, tell me about, how did you discover your passion for helping people? Did this come on at an early age, or?
I think it was always something there. When I look back, I was always kind of like in peer groups or mentoring groups in high school. Just always kind of liked giving back. I've been a big brother, and, it didn't take me too long, into the field out of my undergraduate work to realize, yeah, this is me. And so I kind of always been pulled in that direction. I was always kind of the guy that, people thought listened to them a little differently than other people. I learned that could get you in a lot of trouble if you listen too much to everybody. You had to kind of shut down. Headphones might have saved my career there for a while, because I realized not just my clients had problems, so I didn't want to do therapy in the line at the grocery store every time I went. But, just really enjoyed the dynamics and the challenge of helping, and how everybody needs a different mix of support resources and my skill set, really to help them live a better life. And again, I can't think of any other better way to spend life than, at least the professional side of me getting to go try to make the world a better place a little bit each day.
Nice. Well, I'm just going to very quickly plug, of course, your book.
Look at that cover.
Connecting Paradigms. Highly recommend this. Great for coaches, counselors, therapists, talking about motivational interviewing. And we were neighbors. I didn't realize this, of course. We didn't know each other then.
Yeah.
But tell me about those early years in southern Indianapolis. In the book, I mean, it was quite a read. It was pretty hardcore.
Yeah, so I started out working with, and you may know a little bit about this too, but, in the mid-late 90s when I entered the field, and I know still Indianapolis struggles with this, is, Indianapolis is kind of up there with the murder capitals of the United States. And right. I have to tell people who aren't from Indiana that it's more than cornfields and basketball hoops. Right. Everybody's like, Indiana? And so I got to give them a little bit of history about some of the Chicago gangs, especially the kids I worked were vice lords and gangster disciples coming down and really created war zones in certain isolated pockets of the city. And so, I started my career, the first job I got was at a juvenile justice facility with basically kids that were in the front line of these gang wars and the crack epidemic. And it, just taught me you basically just dropped me into a whole different reality. Because, you would see this war on the news and you could kind of see that, one or two or three or more teenage, usually African-American males, and any bystanders that were tragically caught up in it were dead in our streets. And boy, was it a much different experience to sit across from those same kids and to see, the amazing kids that they were, even though they were dealing with a lot of adult issues, more intense than I've ever dealt with in my entire life. just gave me, a huge lesson in resiliency and some of the challenges that systematically exist in our communities that, really impact some of our youngest members.
Yeah. Share about how trauma affects addictions and how the trauma plays into all of this.
A great question. So I'll try to be somewhat succinct here because it can get pretty deep. But if we're going to look at it from a very sort of simplistic level, and I'm happy to dive in as deep as you want, my friend. But what we see is that, especially during childhood, though trauma throughout the lifespan is absolutely devastating. So I don't want to say one kind of trauma is any worse than the other. But if we see, especially since the brain is rapidly developing during the childhood years, and from a neurobiological perspective, the brain is rapidly developing until age 25. So we can almost scientifically extend adolescence out a lot further than the 18 we kind of used to cut it off, or 16, depending on what we were kind of measuring. And so what we see is that if intense stress, trauma, which I like to say, trauma kind of knocks you down, overwhelms your ability to cope, and you need somebody's help to get back up. Now, you might just be down for a couple days, or you might be down for decades, depending on whether or not the right, again, help comes along. And so, when we see that trauma happens, is, again, especially in childhood, the brain sort of rapidly develops the traits necessary to survive the traumatic event. So with the kids that I was working with coming out of these gang wars, they had developed a neurobiology or brain structure to really thrive and survive in those environments. I mean, I had kids who were working street corners who, to this day, now they were back in 1998. I'm here in 2018, and they still made more money than I make on a daily, monthly, and yearly basis. So, and again, not the skills we want our children to develop, but for kids that were surviving, they could make a pretty good buck off of that as well. And so we see that, again, the brain helps us develop these traits to allow us to survive, but the same traits that allowed those kids to survive out on the streets, when you sat that same kid in a classroom and said, hey, be quiet, pay attention, the problem then happens is they're not able to do it. The survival traits don't translate into a lot of the typical structures that we expect from people, whether that's education or later on employment. So again, you start to see the same things that kept these kids alive. We're also putting them at risk for a whole lot of other different things. And then you mentioned addiction as well. And I can get really nerdy into dopamine and serotonin receptors. But, with addiction, I like to say, basically trauma sets up fertile ground for addiction. If you think about a field ready for a seed to grow, that's unresolved trauma. And I always like to say, if you think about somebody who's gone through a lot of trauma in their life, and you ask them on a scale from 0 to 100, where 0 is you're so depressed you can't even get out of bed in the morning, and 100 is you're the happiest person in the world, that you're so happy you annoy everybody, you're so happy. And, with folks with trauma, they may give you an answer to say, I'm a 20. Whereas somebody maybe who's resolved their trauma and is doing pretty well in life, they say, on that life satisfaction scale, I'm an 85. Now let's say both of those, we've got the person experiencing trauma in the 20 and the person doing pretty well at 85. Let's say they both go to a party. Let's say they're teenagers, because we know kids are oftentimes the addiction starts very early, and both of them try heroin, for example. Now, if you talk about the person who's an 85, they may experience, when they're high, they may be in the 90s, somewhere in there, but they've had really good experiences. They've had peak experiences. They've been a part of a winning team. They've got to go to Disney World. Maybe they're in love. They've had these other experiences where the individual who's struggling at the 20 takes heroin, and now they're up in the 90 and it's the best they've ever felt in their entire life. So what happens is there's a bigger motivation to go use the next day. You know, if you had an experience where you've never felt that good ever, again, your motivation is going to be high to use again. And then again, the biology kicks in pretty quickly, that then the brain that's been structured around trauma, you know, in many ways easily adapts to be structured around the addiction. And it's a way, you know, as we talk about these coping skills, substances initially become a way to cope with the psychological pain, but then addiction starts to cause its own pain and suffering and neurobiological damage as well. So, you know, a lot of complexity going on there. But like I said, if you can think about that as fertile ground, and we see so many of these addictions, not all of them, of course, but so many are not just a chemical dependency of some sort, but they're rooted in past trauma as well, which I think challenges all of us to have at least a dual focus of, you know, we want to help somebody, you know, not use or cut back use, if not get to sobriety, which is usually the ultimate goal. But we might have to look at some of that, help them overcome their trauma as well.
We talked a little bit at the beginning before we started the show, how I first learned about motivational interviewing, and it was in a American Lung Association course. And I had not heard of MI. And my first initial instinct was another modality. So, you know, because, you know, I keep hearing more and more different things. And what makes motivational interviewing different than other modalities of change?
So one, I'd say first and foremost, research. You know, MI is great. I really love a lot of the pieces of it, but what I love most about it is it works. As far as I can tell, and I don't have I don't spend time studying this, but I spend time looking at a lot of different best practices in my work with organizations, sort of to help them make sure that they've integrated what they need to in their programming. And MI is the best research model out there that I've found. The other really cool thing about MI, and we don't talk about this a lot, but I think it's interesting, is most of these best practice modalities out there, a lot of them require advanced degrees to use them. But there's a lot of medical providers, outreach workers, case managers. A lot of folks are not connected initially to a therapist or a master's level, doctoral level clinician. And one of the things I love about MI is we recognize, hey, there's this whole army of people that actually outnumbers the clinical folks like myself by many, many times. And if we can give them some of these skills, you know, they might either help these folks change just with their work with them, or really set them up in a good way for them to eventually come and see me and maybe do a little bit more of the advanced work. So MI, I think there's so much genius in the structure with it. And it's, you know, for whatever reason, it's a cognitive behavioral therapy that will let pretty much anybody do. You can do MI even if you just read an article on it and say you do MI. So it's fascinating how this one transcends the professional barriers that usually exist as well.
Yes. The two things that really jumped out at me was the two questions to ask. And one is, how committed are you to this change? And then the other one about how confident. So share with me about how that works and how it plays into MI.
Yeah, so in MI, one of the things that they talk about is the MI hill. And really, you know, when we talk about change, a lot of the work is done in that initial contemplation of change. There's a great model called the stages of change out there that really says, hey, pretty much everybody, there's always exceptions to the rule, goes through different stages in order to make a major behavioral life change. Whether that's quitting using drugs, whether that's eating healthier. And what we start out as in pre-contemplation is, you know, we often think that somebody who's struggling with an addiction every day, they wake up in the morning and think, am I going to use today or not? Well, you know, if you've smoked every day for the last 20 years, you're not having that thought, maybe you might smoke a pack or two and never have that thought. So pre-contemplation is when, and our brain is really well structured to do what it did the day before, the day before, and the day before. That's how our brain is structured. So we're really designed to repeat those behaviors. So what EMI really helps us do is help somebody contemplate making a change. And you mentioned this, 3 or 4 of the key words is desirability, reason, and need. DARN, they give us their acronym, guys. Miller and Rolnick, who created MI, they're acronym folks. So they give us DARNs to remember. And really, when you talk about that, how important is it for you to make this change? That's that desire, reason, and need. And those are, to me, maybe the 3 most important words in motivational interviewing, because what we're taught as motivational interviewing practitioners is if we hear any of those 3 things, again, desire, reason, and need, we want to help someone explore that. Because in AMI, all this research has shown us that the more they talk about their desire, reason, and need for change, the more likely they are to make the change. So we oftentimes think, if we threaten somebody, if we put, long jail terms on, we kind of think about all these things that we can do to somebody to make them change. But actually what we see is when the number one really predictor of all this is if they have somebody in their life that allows them to talk about making that change in a non-judgmental, passionate sort of partnership way. And then you mentioned the other ones with confidence is that or ability. If somebody doesn't believe they can make the change, then they're likely to get stuck. And so any confidence talk, in MI, they love the word self-efficacy, the understanding that, there's a better future, there's some hope out there that tomorrow can be better than today. And I have some confidence that I can make that happen. And so in MI, especially in those early stages of change, we really want that desirability, reason, and need become very central into climbing up that MI hill of change.
How is it that someone can make choices knowing there are negative consequences? Because sometimes I fall into that judging the client, but how does that affect the perspective, view of the counselor, therapist, coach?
Yeah, great question. So MI challenges us to be non-judgmental. And because again, and this is all research-based, it sounds good. It's kind of like, yeah, we should be there if we're in a good day, best self, got 8 hours of sleep, we'll be there. But really what it showed, one of the key findings in motivational interviewing is support works better than confrontation. So while we might, as the outsider, see every reason this person should change, we can see all the factors. And the folks I've worked with, we're talking about parents that might lose their kids to social services, people that might lose housing and experience homelessness, with the opiate epidemic, that could overdose any day that they're using at the levels they're using. So from our perspective, we can see every reason the person should change. And I've got a lot of probation and parole officer friends over the years, and they'll tell you they can hold decades of jail time over people's head, doesn't change their behavior. So they've really adapted motivational interviewing, not because the criminal justice system doesn't necessarily have some judgment involved in it. It's kind of what it does, but they weren't getting good results. And if you look at a lot of recidivism rates across the country, they're pretty terrible. So when we help the person find their own reason and understand that they may not wake up thinking about, okay, what's the pros and cons of me using today, right? We like to think that. Why, passing the person experiencing homelessness, why don't you just get up your butt and go get a job? Well, when we see the history of these folks, sometimes there's a lot deeper psychological issues going on there. And a lot of these folks, again, are in those early stages of change. So one of the great findings of motivational interviewing that came out in their last edition is that when we jump ahead and we make the argument for action and they're not there yet, that creates resistance. And that's where the change stops. So what we always want to do is take that supportive role. And they actually have a term for this in MI because it's a really hard thing to do called the righting reflex. because human beings are just designed to fix what's wrong in front of us. And yet when we make the argument for change, when we try to fix what's wrong, it actually stops the change process. So being non-judgmental sounds good, just saying, yeah, I'm not going to judge you. I'm going to meet you where you're at. But there's actually a lot of real tangible reasons from the research of why we need to do that. So, whether you're even, didn't get a good night's sleep, you just want to yell at the person of, why don't you change? Not going to be helpful.
Well, tell me about some of your travels with this work. I believe I saw you just got back from DC. Is that correct?
Yeah, just got back actually at an HIV conference in DC. I've had a great stretch. I think it's been like 13 weeks. I've ended up in like about 21, 22 cities, just talking my head off. So somehow life put me is that I talk about my passion and people actually fly me places to do so. So I'm really fortunate in that. One of the things that, and this kind of speaks to the Connecting Paradigms book that you were nice enough to hold up, is really looking at, because MI, the one thing that some folks, and I wouldn't say even struggle with MI, because if you're going to write a book on how to help people change, you want to sort of write to the standard deviation. You want to write to the, even for someone like me who's luckily fairly stably housed, got my own car, has a wife that continues to love me for whatever reason she does to my crazy self. It's hard enough for me to make a change. I sit and can train highly trained professionals about healthy behaviors and talking about all the client behaviors. And then I walk outside and they're all smoking at break, and so we all struggle with this, where I sort of have tried to fill it in where I saw a gap in the research is, how do we help people with the neurobiology of trauma, where they're more in that survival state, where they're thinking not able, just again, because of neurobiological functioning, the parts of the brain that's called the prefrontal cortex that kind of thinks into the future and thinks about cause and effect and future consequences and potential punishments and negative outcomes, is actually we see physically smaller in size in folks that are struggling with trauma. So I really took on the challenge of, okay, like first, how do I get my understanding of folks that have survived trauma to the world? Because it's sort of still this new paradigm that's getting out there. And then what MI gives me is, okay, let's understand these folks and really what they need from us to recover from their trauma. And while we're doing that, as part of that, how can we help them also address some of the big behavioral changes that they have in their lives as well? And so, you think about those young kids that were in the gang that I worked with early on in my career, they came from huge histories of trauma, addiction in the home. There's this study called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, talks about, abuse, check, neglect, check, addiction in the home, divorce, domestic violence. Basically, they could check off all those boxes by, some of them probably as young as the age of 5 or 6. And then we're asking them to drop out of the gang, which, if we were going to send them back to the neighborhood and convince them that they were going to leave the gang, it put their lives at risk. If you want to know one of the reasons why not to change behavior, because somebody's threatening to kill you. And so, they face this intensity. So trying to put some of these puzzle pieces together to give people a really starting point to really implement some of the MI skills that we could do. And my hope is that even if you're not necessarily working with somebody with the kind of trauma that some of the kids and even the families I've worked with in my career have gone through, that you can still utilize the book to find the starting point for the person you're coaching or individual that you're working with, maybe in a less intense setting than I've worked.
Nice. So what is next for you? Trainings, presentations?
Yeah, I just keep talking. So a couple of things on that I'm really excited about. One is continuing more and more work with schools. So schools have really, there's a big push in schools right now for social emotional development, as well as the academic achievement. And really, basically, they're tied closely together. We see kids with greater social emotional intelligence also usually perform higher academically as well. And so with that push, they've really seen, people in the districts have woken up to, hey, trauma is really impacting a lot of our kids. And we're seeing now, you can see that childhood trauma puts a kid at 2.5 times more likely to fail a grade, more likely to be in special education, and all those could potentially huge long-term consequences as well. So I'm really excited to get in schools, because if we can, too often historically we've kind of labeled, and I have a wife who's an elementary school teacher, and she loves the hard kids, which is one of the reasons we get along so well. But even like between kindergarten and first grade, there's already kids that get the bad term kind of label. And I hate that terminology, but any educator will know exactly what I'm talking about. And so instead of seeing that kid as somebody who shows up to school every day intending to be bad or choosing to be bad, what the trauma lens gives us is we can really see, okay, this kid's struggling with something. And if all we do at schools, and I hope we do more than this eventually, is say, if we've got a kid who's struggling academic or behaviorally, and ask, is trauma playing a role in this? And we get that kid help sooner rather than later. As I like to say, let's spend let's invest $1 in a kid, and not $2 later build another homeless shelter or prison system. Because we know that trauma can heal, and the younger and the sooner we get the intervention, the better. So I'm really excited. Actually, my wife and I, the next book is Trauma Sensitive Schools. Hopefully coming out maybe this summer. We'll see. She teaches full time, so you can only push her so much. But so that's coming out hopefully summer or fall of next year. The other thing I'm really excited to get started off is I'm training my first police department as well, and I'm really excited to talk to them, about people experiencing homelessness, but just, who are they working with? And so that's a really exciting piece as well. So I'm just kind of on this wave, and it just takes me to these wonderful places. So, and recently it's taken me to like New Orleans and LA and some warm places, Phoenix. So I've gotten some warm places as well. DC wasn't all that warm, but you can't complain after spending a couple weeks in the sunshine. So
now, have you done any work with like PTSD or veterans?
Yeah, I have. I've done a little work for the VA, and one of the school districts I'm working with, which is really an eye-opener for me, is on Fort Carson, the base down south of Colorado Springs. So highly military. A lot of the staff in the district have been in the military, and so many of the kids are in military families. And a couple things that just has taught me. One I think, I give our society some credit, is we've really come forth and said, it's pathetic that we have vets living out on the street. And we haven't done it yet, but we're getting a lot closer to ending veterans homelessness. And, you won't find anybody more supportive of that than me. They served our country, obviously huge amounts of trauma inherent to that experience. What I hope we do with that as well, and I'll get back to PTSD here in a second, is if we understand that the trauma veteran experiences in war contributes to their struggles with homelessness and employment, relational family health when they come back, I hope eventually we'll take the same empathy and compassion to a grown-up child of abuse as well, that both of them, no fault of their own, they experience that trauma. So that's my big hope there. But, I like to remind your listeners is that we are at war. and that the families bear a lot of these scars. And it's amazing to see the level of PTSD coming home. So many folks I hear is, that they went away one person and they came back another. And you talk about creating traits to survive something like a war zone, especially if you've got these multiple repeated deployments. You almost want to keep the brain that allowed you to survive the deployment. That doesn't do so well just going grocery shopping on a normal Wednesday. And so, you think about those kids that I work with when we try to sit them in school after growing up on the street. Again, we see how these traits that allow us to survive in certain high intense environments can lead to struggles later on. So working with that just makes me a huge respect for our veterans' families, who I think we need to talk a lot more about, and just the cost of war on individuals as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your work with that as well. Not only the addictions, but also the healing part.
Yeah.
Hey, how can our listeners get a hold of you? Your website, your email, your social media?
Yeah, so probably the best way is connectingparadigms.org is my website. You'll find information about the book there. It's on Amazon and pretty much everywhere else I've tried to get it. So there it is right there. Also I wrote a follow-up to it called Talking About Trauma and Change, a very different book. There it is. Love it. And that book's where Connecting Paradigms is really the skill building, the understanding. I wrote Talking About Trauma and Change as how I talk about this stuff, because I use a ton of analogies and stories to really bring the material to life and somewhat allow it to be a little bit more digestible. When I was writing the first book, my wife was my first reader and editor, and she goes, you've got elephants in there, you've got windows in there, you've got all these different, she's like, heroes. She's like, I don't know what I'm reading anymore. And so I had to cut all this beloved stuff out. And then it was like, after I published the first book, which was a huge task in and of itself, I was like, I really love the stuff that fell to the floor. So I kind of picked it all back up and wrote it in a way that I speak to people that are in services. So folks that are in substance abuse treatment or working to get permanent housing or struggling to make life changes. So, because one of the things that I really found was, when I'm able to talk to people in services with a history of trauma, not about their trauma, but about trauma in general, the feedback I often get is I realize for the first time I'm not a bad person. And boy, I can't tell you, I think I was a good therapist. I'm not saying I was a great therapist, but it would take me months to get there with somebody. That kind of understanding that, no, you're not the sum of your behaviors. And yet, sit back, listen like my, professional audiences do about your brain, about this. Great thing about people in services, if you survive an addiction, you're pretty damn smart, excuse my language. So, they get it. You survive homelessness, you get it. And so that's been a really pleasure to talk to folks in services as well. You can also find a Trauma Informed Lens podcast. As I said, I never shut up. Yeah,
I love listening.
Yeah. So me and two other trauma experts, Gary Yeager and Kurt Moyer, every week we put out about an hour where we just discuss certain issues surrounding trauma. I think we're about 70 episodes in and not stopping anywhere in sight. So. And I have a Matt's Mumblings blog there as well, which just allows me to just say what's on my mind at this point. So the next exciting thing coming up too, hopefully in the first of the year, is me and a couple other folks are going to start putting out a self-care podcast as well. Because we know part of the trauma research has shown us that trauma can actually be transferred from someone experiencing a traumatic event or has a history of trauma to an empathetic, compassionate helper as well, whether that's a therapist, a teacher, a police officer, but people who are exposed to trauma Again, we got brain scan evidence, but we also can see folks get diagnosed for post-traumatic stress disorder with the only trauma being their work. So that's another area that I have a lot of passion in as well. So because one podcast isn't enough, why not talk for a couple hours a week? So that, and then social media, Facebook, LinkedIn. I love LinkedIn because I almost have 5,000 followers, and that just astounding to me because how many people in history got connected to 5,000 other people? So I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. LinkedIn is kind of where I post more, but I let people know when there's new blog posts and other things as well.
And I will include all the links on our page that you mentioned and any other information that we can share. And I want to thank you for being on the show today and want to, again, read this book.
Thank you.
Incredible book. And also, I just want to personally thank you. When I read your book, I really got that you cared, and that's very admirable. And you put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into this, and you found your passion. It shows. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today with Awaken the Mind, hosted by David Juhas.
Awaken the mind, you need to understand. If you can't, you must, and if you must, you can. Now that I got you, let me put you in a trance. Got you feeling hypnotic, your mind, let me massage it. Your thoughts are getting quiet, your stress subsiding. You starting to see images, but it ain't no mirages. Think it's time to calibrate. Take a breath and concentrate. Get into your subconscious. Time to feel the energy, the brain waves. Let's go deep into your memory. Beware of self, let the worries melt. All you see is you and you don't see no one else. Auditory digital, talking to yourself. It might seem bizarre, a feeling you never felt. This is your time to shine. Awaken the mind, the NLP and hypnosis guide. Yeah.